Okay, well, there's a lot to think about when you're in an MMA fight. In fact, well, any fight, actually, but there's legs and arms flying everywhere. You have to be hyper aware of every inch of movement your opponent makes, and the margin for errors are smaller than Stephen Wonderboy Thompson's ego.
I'm not giving up on it, my friend. I'm not giving up on that title.
So it's not surprising that we've seen a few times, even at the highest level, fighters make a decision that they immediately regretted, and it ended up with their opponent's hand getting raised. I'm Balian from MMA On Point, and these are 10 fighter decisions that immediately led to a loss. Number 10, Ryan Hall versus Ilia Topuria. I think it's pretty impossible to be an MMA fan in 2023 at this point and not know who Ilia Topuria is. The 13-0 undefeated prospect has finished 4 of his 5 UFC opponents, and pretty much all of them have been highlight reel worthy. But back in 2021, not many people knew exactly what he was capable of. Least of all, it seemed, Ryan Hall. The man they called the Wizard had pretty much breezed through the majority of his MMA career by simply just leg-locking anyone he could ankle pick or jam roly-poly into. But where most UFC opponents had been able to neutralize and avoid Hall's magical jiu-jitsu, the black belt Ilia was ready to swim with the sharks. Now, despite Ryan's attempts to either dive onto a leg or throw a spinning kick being shut down throughout the entire round, Ryan telegraphed a wheel kick and Topuria read it perfectly and immediately shut out his lights with ground and pound. But I guess Ryan forgot what he wrote down before the fight, and Ilia just made him pay. We almost saw this exact same thing play out between Alexa Grasso and Valentina Shevchenko, where as soon as Valentina threw her spinning back kick, Alex sidestepped, took her back, and it was game over. Number 9, Takanori Gomi versus Nick Diaz. I mean, come on. This is one of the best fights of all time, right? Like, I'm glad it's in this list so I can talk about it, because no day is not a good day to rewatch Nick Diaz versus Gomi at Pride 33. They were heading back to the States for this one, so the card featured some US stars, like Dan Henderson trying to take the Pride middleweight belt from the only man that had ever held it, Wanderlei Silva. But before that, it was time for a Japanese-US showdown. Nick was coming off the back of 2 spectacular performances in the UFC, and Gomi was the reigning Pride lightweight champion and had only lost once in the last 14 years. Gomi actually shot a takedown at the opening bell, but quickly realised Nick's guard was not to be messed with, so they had an absolute slugfest on the feet. Gomi dropped Nick with his signature fastball punches, but he survived. But in the final round, Nick got cut, and it honestly looked like the refs might stop it. But he still put a beating on Gomi, who with 3.5 minutes left, shot a takedown and was wrapped up in a go-go plier that turned him a nice blue hue.
Fresh and juicy, ready for the picking.
Gomi had already experienced Nick on the ground in the first round. Now he was even more tired, and he was still landing punches. If it had stayed on the feet, the doctors might even have gotten involved. But he shot that takedown, was really tired, landed in Nick's guard, and was immediately finished. Shame it became a no contest after a positive marijuana test. You know, anything over a 15 ratio is positive with the NSAC. But they allow you to test up to 50 going into competition. Well, Nick tested a 175, so yeah, he was definitely high that night. Number 8, Cain Velasquez versus Fabricio Werdum. Unless you're a new fan of the sport, you probably know what went down in Mexico City at UFC 188. The UFC were returning to Mexico, but this time with a heavyweight champion of Mexican heritage headlining the card and defending his title, no less. But the main thing to know is his opponent, Fabricio Werdum, travelled out to Mexico City 6 weeks before the fight, where he trained at altitude to adjust his body and acclimatise to the 7,000-foot elevation. Cain, however, did not head out until 2 weeks before the fight, something he apparently had been coaxed into, and he was also coming off 600 days off because of injuries, so turns out backstage many of the other fighters ended up throwing up because of the altitude and the severity of it. Still, it was apparent basically from the start that the usual pace Cain keeps in a fight just was not there, and he was starting to fade as Werdum was landing punches on his chin. By the third round, Cain was completely exhausted, battered, and cut open. And it may have been out of exhaustion or desperation, but he shot a double leg in the third round, and his head was on the outside, so Fabricio slapped on a guillotine, forcing the tap. It's hard to tell whether Cain would have been able to survive much longer on the feet anyway, but considering Werdum also said he trained specifically for that exact moment, and as soon as Cain did it, well, the fight was already over. So the choice to go for a double leg unfortunately led to an immediate defeat in this one. Number 7, Kazuhiro Kusayanagi versus Carlos Newton. Alright, I'm going to hit you with another old school entry right here, but there have been examples of this throughout the history of MMA, where one guy goes for a submission and immediately gets countered by their opponent.
You triggered my trap card!
But one of the best examples comes from back in 1998 in Shuto, when MMA legend and BJJ black belt Carlos Newton took on Kazuhiro. While in bottom side control, Kaz starts working on a Kimura, and Carlos steps over his head and counters immediately with an armbar. Probably wasn't a good idea to do that against the superior grappler, to be honest. And we've definitely seen this in the UFC, with the first fight between Matt Hughes and George St. Pierre. Matt's in top half guard, GSP grabs an arm to go for a Kimura, and Matt says thank you very much and collects his arm for an armbar. And even more recently, between Jeremy Stephens and Mateusz Gamrot, Matt takes the little heathen down, and Jeremy decides to try and Kimura him, but that unfortunately left him in prime position to get Kimura'd himself. Well, there you go. Sometimes you go for a submission and you get submitted, I guess. Number 6, Mike Grundy versus Makwan Amirkhani. I know most people say England doesn't have any wrestlers, but at the very least in MMA there's guys like Mike Grundy, who represented Great Britain in the World Championships, the Commonwealth Games, and when he got to the UFC, he already had a great MMA career. 11-1, not bad at all. He even won his debut by TKO, and hey, he didn't even have to use any wrestling. But he dropped his next 2 UFC fights by decision, and coming into his matchup in London against Makwan Amirkhani, he desperately needed to get a win, or it could mean the end of his UFC career. It's also possible that he was maybe a little too desperate, as just 10 seconds in he shot a takedown, his head ended up on the outside, and Makwan did what he does best, wrapped up his neck. It's pretty much a worst case scenario game plan from Mike, especially as Mr. Finland, who might as well be called Mr. Anaconda as his last 3 wins now in the UFC are all with that choke. He tightened everything up, and just a few seconds later, Mike was unconscious. Number 5, Fabricio Werdum versus Stipe Miocic. After Werdum tapped Fedor in Strikeforce and flipped the heavyweight world on its head, he immediately lost to Overeem in a kind of weird performance where he kept falling over trying to bait the Reem into his guard. So when he arrived in the UFC the following year, it was with some hype, sure, but also a fair amount of doubt about his abilities to actually compete with some of the best of the division. But under the master Rafael Cordeiro, his striking skills evolved before our very eyes, and he started to beat up the likes of Roy Nelson, Mike Rousseau, and Travis Brown. He even flying knee finished the K1 kickboxing legend Mark Hunt, and then tapped Sea-Level Cain to become the champion. It was a historic career resurgence as one of the oldest fighters in UFC history to capture a title. What happened against Stipe Miocic was kind of anything but. Apart from getting everyone to try and wear his happy mask, during the first round with Stipe, about halfway through, he decided to run at the challenger, and rightly so, he was clocked right in the mush. But then he immediately ran at him again, and this time, well, he was put out unconscious. Not entirely sure what he was trying to achieve, I'm not a world champion, and Stipe seemed pretty surprised to be one after that. Maybe it was because the guy just ran at him. I don't know. Number 4, Andrei Arlovski versus Fedor Emilianenko. Well, after the UFC bought out Pride, the most enthusiastic fans assumed that meant Fedor was finally coming over to the UFC to fight the only roster of heavyweights he hadn't already beaten up. But rarely in MMA are things that simple, and Fedor ended up fighting for the new promotion, Affliction, and they did some freaking crazy stuff, forking out over $3 million in fighter purses for their first show, and even hiring Megadeth to play at the event. The second show, though, saw former UFC champion Andrei Arlovski take on the legend Fedor in the main event, and it was a pretty massive fight. It was competitive too, but Andrei's speed started to take over, and he backed up Fedor, but instead of continuing his boxing assault, he decided to throw a flying knee because, okay, sure, and Fedor capitalized immediately, timing an overhand right that absolutely flatlined him. It might have seemed like a good idea, but unfortunately, it just led straight to the loss. Number 3, Lena Lansberg versus Myra Bueno Silva. Have you ever been goaded into a fight?
I want to fight you.
Not even a fight, just like a 1v1 on COD or something. Maybe you've just had a proper Marty McFly moment.
Nobody calls me chicken needles. Nobody!
Basically, when the Swede Lena Lansberg took on the Brazilian BJJ ace Myra Bueno Silva, they had a good old scrap inside the apex, and it was very back and forth at first until Silva got a takedown and pretty much showed she had a massive advantage on the ground over Lena. Not all too surprising, you know, Lena was a Muay Thai champion, Silva already had 6 wins by submission. Still, she survived until round 2 until the same thing happened just 30 seconds in, and looking a bit like Magikarp before its evolution, it seemed like it might just all be over for Lena. But she found her way back up with 30 seconds left, and then did something quite surprising. She jumped straight back on top of her. Yeah, it was kind of alarming, and then when 10 seconds later she was tapping to a knee bar, it seemed like she'd kind of made a bad decision. Not entirely sure on the thought process on that one, but it turned out to be a performance of the night for Silva. Number 2, Cat Zingano versus Ronda Rousey. After Ronda armbarred her way into the UFC, they wanted to do a season of The Ultimate Fighter to bring in a bunch of other ladies and a whole new division. The UFC set up a fight between Miocic and Cat Zingano to decide who would get to coach opposite Ronda, and the then undefeated Cat TKO'd her in the 3rd round. But Kat got injured, and well, Miocic stepped in and took her place on the show, which, worked pretty well. Her and Ronda were rivals, and then Kat would actually have to wait a whole 2 years before she got her shot, while Rousey went through a list of contenders. But Kat managed to stay undefeated during that time. She even TKO'd Amanda Nunes in the 3rd round after another gutsy performance. And then, after a lot of personal struggles, she finally got her long-awaited, well-deserved and well-earned shot at Ronda Rousey. It was supposed to be Ronda's toughest fight yet, and what did Kat do? Well, from the opening bell, she ran right at her, threw a flying knee, got clinched, thrown to the ground, and immediately submitted. Her decision to run at the judo black belt Olympian submission machine and put herself right in literally the worst spot possible, inevitably and immediately led to a loss.
I am inevitable.
Number 1. Big Nog versus Frank Mir 2. Old Big Nog with his big noggin had already lost to Frank Mir for the interim title back at UFC 92. When they met for the second time, 3 years later, the Minotaur had just lured a helpless Brendan Schaub into his labyrinth for a knockout of the night finish, ending his 4-fight win streak as well. So they booked a rematch between the two submission legends who would settle the score at dawn, or at UFC 140. That also worked. Big Nog started hammering away at Frank until he dropped him in the first round. Mir looked completely out of it, face down with Big Nog just hammering away. I mean, shit, he could already have been unconscious, but the ref didn't stop it. He just told Nog not to hit him in the back of the head. And so Antonio decided to sit back for a guillotine and put Frank out that way. Instead of getting the finish, Frank managed to scramble on top, grab a Kimura, and snap Big Nog's shoulder in half. And Big Nog just let him get away like Keanu in Point Break. Okay then folks, before you disappear, make sure you give some love to the editor of this video, Luke Taylor. Check him out on Twitter at @calltome_ if you want to follow him and his business. Ben Rosette did the intro music as he always does, so thank you, Ben. And let us know in the comments below what you think. Oh, and nobody put Chris Weidman versus Luke Rockhold. Okay, that wasn't an immediate finish. He beat the crap out of him for like 2 more rounds. Make sure to give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed it and hit the subscribe button. I've been Balian. I'll be back in the next one. Cheers.